Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen to a discussion between William Inboden, Director of the Clements Center at the University of Texas, and Richard Fontaine, President of the Center for New American Security. Theirs is a wide-ranging discussion that spans the globe, looking at issues of great power competition, making a distinction between the threats, risks, and challenges posed by great power competition with Russia and those posed by great power competition with China. It also expands to discussion of U.S. relations with India and other great powers. Let's listen in on a fascinating conversation.
All right, this is Will Inboden. I'm here in Austin, Texas with Richard Fontaine, the president of the Center for New American Security, a longtime friend of mine, a very distinguished and accomplished policymaker in his own right, including being a veteran of the Bush administration, as am I, and a longtime congressional staffer for Senator John McCain in the Senate as well. Richard, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be in Austin. I think, do we call this God's country? Is that what it's known as?
Well, that's what God calls it. His country. So, yes,
that's great.
That's right.
No, it's great to be out here.
For our listeners, this is Richard's maiden journey to Austin. So we are honored to be hosting him, and we hope you'll be coming back plenty more times. So
I had this weird experience. I was walking in here this morning, and people were making eye contact and smiling, and a couple of people kind of said something approaching good morning. I was like, what do they want? What's going on here? I'm from Washington. But it turns out they're just really nice.
Yeah. So. When my wife and I moved here 10 years ago now, we moved most immediately from London, which is a wonderful city, but not terribly friendly. And our first weekend here, my wife was in line at the grocery store, and someone started chatting with her, making conversation. She thought, are they trying to mug me? What is this? So, So for our listeners outside Austin, especially those in the Beltway, this is a friendly place.
Yeah.
So you're welcome to come see us, but if you come see us, keep it friendly.
Yeah,
so, anyway.
Exactly.
All right. So, Richard, we're just going to do a bit of a tour de horizon here on the world situation. Our listeners know, because I reference it often, I'm currently writing a history of Reagan administration foreign policy. And I recently covered the transition from Al Haig to George Shultz at the State Department. And when Reagan picked Shultz to be Secretary of State, Shultz was the president of Bechtel, the big construction company, and was doing a Bechtel board meeting in London when he got the call from Reagan. And, Shultz immediately accepted, and the next morning was on the Concorde from London to back to the United States to meet with the president and get his marching orders. And as Shultz records in his memoir, he had 4 hours on the Concordes, and he used it to assess the world situation. So think about, what is this new job I'm taking? So, Richard, that's going to be your task today with us. Right. Please help us assess the world situation. Let me start first with a question about this reemergence of great power competition, this era we're in. We'll start with a big picture one. And let me frame it for you this way, since one of our themes here is history, recent history. 10 years ago, March of 2010, the world looked really different, right? We were coming out of the financial crisis, still recovering. And the discourse at the time was, are we going to have a G2 with China, right? The Obama administration was pursuing its reset with Russia. There was minimal activity by China in the South China Sea. Russia had not invaded Crimea and Ukraine yet. The surge seemed to have brought some very positive returns in Iraq, which was reasonably stable. ISIS had not emerged yet. The Arab Spring hadn't started. That doesn't start until 9 months later. It was just a very different world. And yet that was only 10 years ago. And now we find ourselves in this great power competition. How did this happen? Did we, as strategists, scholars, policymakers, what did we miss 10 years ago? Or was it actually there and we just weren't paying enough attention?
There was some of it was there. I think really what's happened is that the priority of Russia and China as foreign policy priorities essentially have manifestly risen to the top just because of some of the events that you talked about. So certainly Crimea and the Donbass and Putin's much more risk-tolerant, aggressive approach to foreign policy is meddling in the 2016 election. You can sort of go through Russian behavior. And then China, a little bit more subtle in some ways, but broader in effect in terms of its economic weight and its technological investments and the sort of creeping illiberalism that has the South China Sea. You put all these things together, and there's a strong case for for Russia and China. China, I think, actually has changed pretty significantly just since Xi Jinping took over the party. The sort of bide your time and keep your head down is out the window, and so it is a more assertive China. But that said, the other companion effect here has been to deprioritize the other issues that we cared about so much for so long. So if foreign policy, as the national defense strategy sort of bluntly states, terrorism is not the top priority of the country when it comes to defense. It was for a very long time. We are not pouring hundreds of thousands of troops into the greater Middle East in order to try to beat the Taliban in Afghanistan or try to, surge in Iraq and so forth. And if anything, there's a sense that we've wasted blood and treasure in the sands of the Middle East for way too long and sort of taken our eye off the ball on what's happened in other places. Now, that said, I think it's important to note that there's a different policymaker consensus that's being built around great power competition that is not reflected outside Washington very well. If you look at the polls, a whole variety of polls show that Americans would list the top priorities for U.S. foreign policy, the top threats to the United States, as stuff much closer to home, so to speak. So terrorism is always at or near the top, cyber attacks, Iran, North Korea types of things, climate change keeps rising, and refugees and immigrants have risen. And only after all of those things do you tend to get down to Russia and China as this should be really the focus of our foreign policy. So there is I kind of call it that great power disconnect. I think policymakers, Republican and Democrat in Washington, to have religion on this idea that we're in this new era of great power competition. It does not seem to be at the top of the priority list for the American people. And then, that has interesting potential implications.
Yeah. Well, let me follow up on that, especially since, we're here in Austin right now. So, part of the heartland in our own unique way. Do you worry that our nation's national security leadership, and of course I'm primarily speaking of the Trump administration because they're in power, but this is a bipartisan question as far as senior Democrats and elder statesmen, are they failing in not building enough popular support for the posture we need to have for a great power competition? So in other words, if the policymakers know and see that this is where we're going, but the people are not with you, is that sustainable, or is that going to undercut our ability to ways wise and effective and well-resourced strategy?
Yeah, I think it does undermine the political sustainability of a long-term competitive strategy with respect to China and Russia if Americans don't prioritize those things. However, I have a different view than the standard response to that, which is we have to educate 330 million Americans about the way things really are that they seem to be missing. And it would be helpful if we make it clearer than the truth, so that they realize just how dastardly the future may be, and therefore are willing to expend the kind of resources and generate the kind of political will necessary for a long-term competitive strategy. Yeah. There is something to being very clear about what policymakers and our political leaders think are the challenges that are looming on the horizon. But I don't think the companion of that is to dismiss those concerns and perceived threats that I mentioned just a minute ago that Americans have. So I don't, we're going through this moment in Washington where the tendency seems to be to say, oh my God, the Middle East is a complete sideshow. Terrorism, we've completely overblown the potential impact. We never should have done any of these things. We should stop doing the ones we're continuing to do. Let's focus on China, and then maybe a little bit of Russia in our spare time. And of course, we're not a regional power, and bad things happen if we disengage too much. So I think what we need to do is determine what kind of the basic minimum sustainable strategy is to deal with these various issues: terrorism, climate change, Iran, North Korea, things like that, while we do China and Russia policy. I don't think this is like an either or, that we have to pivot from the rest of the world to great powers. Mm-hmm. We have to deal with the competitive nature of great power existence in the world today while we do these other things. But that's not a particularly popular position.
Yeah, but good for you for reminding all of us that we do need to be listening to average citizens, the ones who pay the bills for this, who bear a lot of the costs for this, and may have some of their own other concerns and may not be fully persuaded of everything involved in the great power competition. So I think one of the many sources of the current divisions we're feeling as a country is this disconnect between elites and popular opinion. And I say that as someone who, in a lot of ways, would be a card-carrying member of the elite. So I don't want to sound too disparaging there, but we are positioned here in Texas to, in some ways, sit athwart that divide and see it on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think we in the policy community make a mistake if we think that the transmission belt of ideas should only go in one direction. That it is our responsibility to educate the American people about the way things really are, so that they will then generate the political will necessary to execute the policies we would like to see obtained. Certainly, there is an element to that. That's part of political leadership. But the other prong of that is to listen to what's on people's minds, listen to what really they find troubling about the world we're in or the potential opportunities. I mean, the one of the things that unifies the top threats, if you look across the polls, is they're direct. It's not we're worried about China's militarization of the South China Sea, because if we somehow wanted to get into war with China over Taiwan and they could back us up in terms of naval assets that's not the way. But when North Korea has a long-range missile that could hit the United States with a nuclear weapon, suddenly people quite reasonably think that's a threat. When terrorists threaten to kill Americans, that's an obvious threat. Climate change is seen as an obvious threat, and it's almost a more commonsensical way of thinking about what the threats are to the country. So again, I think we got to listen, not just preach.
One more question on great power competition as a category before we pivot, verb I use intentionally, towards a more specific discussion on China is, great power competition, it's a conceptual category, and what we're really talking about there is both Russia and China. And yet, while there may be some commonalities in their interests and the threat they pose to American interests, they're also very different countries with different capabilities and different trajectories. Give us your synopsis on how should we think about the threat or challenge posed by Russia. We'll come to China in a minute, but I don't want to just be too dismissive there of Russia, because it is a different one than China.
Yeah, I mean, I think the threat posed by Russia is the more acute and serious one in the short run than the threat posed by China, because Russia has shown both capability and will to disrupt our democratic practice, which is the core of American political life. I mean, yes, we have to be prepared for Russia to move into Estonia with tank columns, and NATO has to go and beat them back. We have to be prepared for that. But the chances that they would do that is relatively small. The chances that they are going to sow division at home in the United States so as to put us at each other's throats and make it harder for us to project power because we are more divided is 100%, because they're doing it right now. They did in 2016. They're doing it right now. It's a high potential payoff, low cost strategy of theirs. And that is a national security threat to the United States. It's not a theoretical threat of, what if Russia did this or that or the other thing. It's having bad effects every day. And so that's how I see the chief Russian threat. And I think the Russians right now are far more risk tolerant. You're the historian, but there's always this question about whether declining powers are more risk tolerant because they have less skin in the game and they have less to lose as their policy
much upside for a
waxes in a particular order. I mean, I don't know, the Austro-Hungarian Empire maybe is an example of this.
The Ottomans,
so exactly, the Ottomans, and I think you're seeing a little bit of that effect today.
Yeah. So, although it is interesting to trace Russia's trajectory, one of a vignette I use with my students sometimes just to show them how our prognostications can get things wrong is. In 2000, I can't remember the exact month, but sometime in the year 2000, the Atlantic Monthly published a cover story about Russia, and it was titled "Russia is Finished." And it was, I won't mention the name, but it's done by a very prominent, serious, well-informed American scholar of Russia. This was not some hack piece by any means. And it had a very arresting cover image. It showed two Russian soldiers, both wearing their uniforms, and both were like emaciated 15-year-olds, just looked, really gaunt. And over the next 30-some pages of the article, just kind of lays out Russia's, demographic death spiral, the diminished life expectancy, the hollowed out, decrepit military, the totally defunct economy, the rampant corruption, the poor governance, and all of that. It's essentially, the argument was this is Somalia with more land and nuclear weapons, really, is what it was. And so it was data-driven, it was an objective analysis, and yet it got it completely wrong, right? Because it missed the rise of Putin, it missed the boom in hydrocarbon prices and the resurgence of and a lot of those same factors that were afflicting Russia in 2000 are still there 20 years later, as far as difficult demographics and the imbalanced economy and so on and so forth. But I just use that as a cautionary note that when we still look at those factors and say, medium and long term, Russia is a declining power. I think overall it is. On the other hand, predictions of its demise have been greatly exaggerated before.
Totally. And I think of it as a declining great power, right? So, I mean, it would be little solace to, folks in the Balkans to think of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a declining power, right? Or anyone on the Ottoman Empire's periphery to think of the Ottomans as sick man in Europe for hundreds of years. That may have been true. In fact, it was true. If you look at the sort of straight line, decline in their resource base, what they're able to do, their governance and things like that, it didn't make it less dangerous. And so it is one thing to say over time they are and will continue to be a declining power, just in terms of what their share of global GDP is, and they may be able to in the medium term, their military modernization has been quite effective and things like that. However, that's a very different thing to saying, let's not worry about these guys because this is Somalia with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
If nothing else, I would worry about
Somalia.
Yeah, well, I would worry about Somalia with nuclear weapons.
Yes,
I mean, so for starters, so I don't think that kind of gives you a pass of, and I think this was how much of this was internal Obama administration thinking versus the external sort of play, but this kind of thing that, Russia's going to get itself bogged down in the quagmire of Syria, and Russia's a regional power that can't project its will, otherwise, I mean, that turns out to be wrong.
Yeah.
So it's not great solace, shall we say, to say that someone who thinks of the United States as an adversary may be a gradually declining power.
Yeah. And of course, power is not just the capabilities you possess, but the willingness to employ them and how effective. And Putin is, even if he has a relatively weak hand, has played it pretty shrewdly and aggressively and has some gains to show for it.
Very impressively. I mean, I think we could learn something from Putin, particularly in the Middle East. If you look at the amount of attention and momentum that Putin has been able to generate through its military intervention in Syria, the United States has the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and bases, huge air bases in Qatar and in UAE, and we have thousands of troops in Iraq, and we have
a presence in Saudi Arabia again.
A presence in Saudi Arabia, a presence in Syria. Special operations forces have been active in places like Yemen and Libya, and you add this together, it's a titanic footprint compared to what the Russians have maintained in the region. And yet, if you go to the Middle East, everybody is talking about how they need to talk to the Russians about what the shape of the region looks like tomorrow. And it's because they've done a lot with not that much.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, going back to insights from history, Russia has not been a major player in the Middle East since, I believe it was 1972 that Sadat kicked the Russian advisors out of Egypt. And so Putin has not just made a particular play in Syria. This is a regional play of reasserting Russia as one of the, dominant outside powers in the region that can't control all the outcomes, but can set the agenda. And as you're saying, that's why we see Middle Eastern leaders, Arab, Persian, and Israeli traveling to Moscow as often as if not more, that they're traveling to Washington. So, okay, well, because we are assessing the world situation and not just Russia, we're going to pivot now to China. Let me tee up a couple questions for you with two preliminary observations, and there's a question at the end of them. The first is going back to your point about some of the disconnect between public opinion and the threat environment that the strategic community is looking at. I largely agree with you, but the one asterisk I would put is I do think the American public has, for a couple, at least 10, if not 20 years now, been shown some skepticism towards China, not so much as a security threat, but on two grounds. One, economically, just seeing, a lot of American, manufacturing jobs displaced in part by, outsourcing competition from China. So there's been that sense. And then also on the human rights and religious freedom front, American Christians, for years have been hearing on Sundays about China's persecution of Christians there, and of course, the Tibetan Buddhists and other Uyghurs, right? And so in that sense, even though most Americans hadn't seen China as a security threat, there was some latent skepticism about, is this country really a good actor in the world, and is it really a good partner for the United States? So that's why I do think even in the 2016 campaign, as divisive as it was, there was a bipartisan consensus on China's not a friend anymore, especially on the economic front. But as far as what do we do about this, you made a passing reference earlier to competitive strategies. Could you give our listeners a quick little primer on competitive strategies, because it's a really important concept? And then let's ask, how well are we doing with that vis-a-vis China, especially looking at a lot of their advances in technology? So in some ways, they're almost flipping competitive strategies on its head. Some of the technological advantages the United States leveraged with our competitive strategies toward the Soviets in the 70s and 80s. China maybe having some advances on us there. Maybe I'm being a little too alarmist. So anyway, give us a little primer on what that means, and then and how well are we doing it with it in a China framework?
Well, I should first put in a plug for the congressionally mandated independent assessment of the U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific, which CNAS published, I don't know, a month ago, something like that, called Rising to the China Challenge. We had a lot of people say, well, we've got a military strategy toward China. We kind of have an economic strategy. We don't really have a technology strategy, diplomacy. No one really has put together a comprehensive competitive strategy toward China. So we did, and we wrote one. And if anybody is interested, it is there in all of its glory on the CNAS website.
And that's cnas.org,
exactly.
And the title is Rising to the China Challenge.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And actually, it's indicative of the way the politics of China policy have changed over the past few years, that the reaction to this was bipartisan support in both houses and in the administration, which you find me an issue where you get that, really. And but China policy is one of them today, precisely for some of the reasons you just described. And that actually gives a lot of freedom of maneuver to the president, for example. I mean, Democrats and some Republicans will push back against what he wants to do on almost every other issue: Iran, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Russia, you name it. Iran, but not China. He can be as tough as he wants, or and if anything, Hill Democrats will say either this is the one area I agree with him, or he's not going far enough. Sometimes there's disagreement on priorities, trade deficit, or whatever, but not the general inclination. In terms of the competitive strategy aspect of this, I mean, the easiest way of boiling this down is, if you want to compete effectively with an adversary, you can make yourself stronger or make him weaker, right? I mean, that's kind of at the if you boil it all down to that. And so, and then you have to think about what are the domains in which you're going to compete, and then are there domains that are going to either be hermetically sealed from competition or active attempts at cooperation and so forth. In this report, what we did is actually, there are some areas of Chinese vulnerability that in a grand competition with that country, we think the United States should try to take advantage of. But actually, the bigger part is, in order to compete more effectively, the answer is to build a better America, to make ourselves stronger. No easy task, but we've done this before. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's that external stimulus that's necessary to get things done at home that otherwise can't be done. I mean, today everybody wants an infrastructure bill. Republicans want it, Democrats want it, the administration wants it, but we have none. Why? Because there's nobody pushing it together. During the Cold War, the interstate highway system was not developed to build nice suburbs outside of Austin, but rather, Eisenhower wanted to get the troops around the country if necessary in a Cold War, right? ARPANET gave birth to the internet that came out of the defense sector. Mm-hmm. Investments in STEM education and area studies, the manned space program. You can go through, a bunch of things, GPS, and say that the external stimulus of the Cold War produced things that strengthened the United States in a way that it otherwise wouldn't.
Series of Sputnik moments. Yeah,
exactly. Now, that's not a reason to go find yourself a new Cold War, right? That's not grounds for going out and finding somebody to get in the middle of a Cold War. But if you're going to be stuck with something approaching a Cold War with China anyway, we have to be able to harness that external stimulus to generate the kind of political will to do things that will strengthen our country at home. Yeah. And that is what will ultimately make us better able to compete with the Chinese or anybody, frankly, that, that we need to compete with in the future.
Yeah. Richard, let me ask you about an issue that you may not be doing as much work on now, but I know you've done it quite a bit on historically in your career, vis-a-vis China. And this is human rights, democracy promotion. A line I sometimes use when talking about China, which may be a little exaggerated, but I don't know that it's totally wrong, is that I think at the end of the day, Xi Jinping fears his own people more than he fears an outside power like the United States. And if you look at the massive resources China devotes to, controlling and monitoring its people, to suppressing dissent. And yet when you look at things like the Hong Kong protests or the concentration camps in Xinjiang province where 1.5 million Uyghurs are, or the ongoing suppression of activist lawyers and house church pastors and independent Catholic priests and Tibetan Buddhists, I could go on. And yet a bipartisan criticism I have of the Obama administration and the Trump administration is neither one really made a priority of pushing, supporting dissidents in China and pushing human rights. Mm-hmm. They do a few things here and there, but it wasn't a part of an overall strategy. Is that still missing? Should the United States be doing more on that? Or would that be a distraction or undercut some of our other strategic equities?
Yeah, here is where you run up against the inherent contradictions that always exist in America's human rights diplomacy, right? So, the real cardinal rule of human rights diplomacy is if you can't beat up on the small countries, who can you beat up on, right? The smaller the country, the fewer non-human rights equities we have with it, the Burmas of the world, the more we can afford to really focus on the human rights problems in those countries.
Venezuela.
Yeah. The bigger the country and the broader the agenda with that country. Mm-hmm. So with China, we've got diplomatic equities and economic equities. We don't like what they're doing on the military side. The agenda is very, very long, right? Then it gets harder because you have to make a decision about where the human rights basket fits in the priority list. Is it number one? Is it number three? If it's lower than number three, the Chinese and no one else will really listen. If it's number 6 or 7 on your list, then might as well not really be on there at all. Mm-hmm. Now that said, the thing that actually allows for an opportunity here is the hardest of all is when you got a friendly autocrat that you want to push for human rights, and you have those other equities. Witness Saudi Arabia, which or some other friendly country, right? We don't have that problem anymore with China, really. And so I actually think that the promotion of democracy and human rights can fit into a larger competitive strategy with respect to China. Again, putting us on the right side of this issue and pointing out that China is on the wrong side of this issue, because there is a bit of a competitive battle of narratives and ideological models and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, everyone in the world, and certainly everyone in Muslim countries, should know exactly what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Everybody. And we should help them know that. Hong Kong is, obviously a different example. But that's the kind of thing, the lack of religious freedom, the lack of basic human rights, and we should be pointing out the broader flaws that this top-down autocratic, clampdown on information has when it comes to things like dealing with coronavirus.
Right. Yeah. The reason why it took so long for word to even get out and why it had already spread much further is because they first, censored the doctor who alerted it. And yeah. So
we should not want the coupling of Chinese brand of autocracy with high economic growth rates, which is very different than what we'd had to deal with the Cold War, when they had low economic growth rates and a terrible political system.
Yeah,
now, we don't want that to be more attractive to people than our model, which is one based on individual liberty, the rule of law, and basic freedoms, and
free markets and free minds.
Yeah, and so I think we have to point out the contradictions at home in China when it comes to this. So that's probably a long-winded answer to say, yeah, it should be on the agenda.
Okay. Awesome. Well, and again, drawing on insights from history in this book I'm writing on Reagan's foreign policy, this is one thing that Reagan and Secretary of State Shultz did make front and center on their Soviet policy. It was including human rights in it, and it drove the Kremlin crazy.
Yeah.
But Reagan and Shultz believed in it as a normative good, but also knew that this exposed the illegitimacy and repressiveness of the Soviet system and kind of undermined some Kremlin rule by supporting these dissident voices. So and so it actually, in their case, they saw it as strengthening their hand when it came to arms control negotiations or trying to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan or other issues there. So
even arch realpolitik practitioner Henry Kissinger, when he famously recommended to Gerald Ford that he not meet with Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he came, and subsequently said, look, that wasn't the right call. He should have met with him, and the human rights advocates have essentially won, though, especially when you can align the pressure on human rights with a broader notion of competition with an adversary country.
Yeah, so a lot more we could say and do on China, but again, we've got to keep spinning the globe a little bit here since we are assessing the world situation. Other recent news item, this provisional peace deal that the United States has signed with the Taliban on Afghanistan. A lot of pieces yet to be put in place, a lot of implementation, big issues, of course, about the Afghan government being brought in to negotiate with the Taliban, so on and so forth. At the same time, this is a significant moment, whether good or bad, we shall see, in what has been at almost 19 years now, arguably our longest war as a country. Give us the good, the bad, and the ugly on the provisional peace deal.
I would say there's the hopeful and the probable.
Okay.
The hopeful is that this will, in fact, be a set of guarantees that the Taliban will stick to, that will allow for inter-Afghan dialogue and political resolution to this 19-year war and the extraction over time of American troops in a way that doesn't allow Afghanistan to become a sanctuary once again for international terrorists. Now, that's the hopeful. I don't attach a particularly high probability to that outcome. And in part, and it's sort of fun to geek out on some of these historical analogies without going too far about it, but things that maybe only you would appreciate. But I think there's some pretty eerie parallels between the Vietnam War endgame and the Afghanistan endgame. I mean, in 1973,
a Paris Peace Accord.
Exactly. So Henry Kissinger's meeting with Lee Duc-Tho. Henry Kissinger,
for our listeners, that's the lead negotiator for the North Vietnamese.
Right. And so who wasn't at the table? The South Vietnamese. Who's not at the table now? The government of Afghanistan, for very obvious reasons and understandable reasons. But our partner, I don't want to say client state, but our partner did not have a seat at the table. And the idea was that an agreement between the United States and the enemy could pave the way for a political resolution between the warring parties on the ground. The other thing was, it became pretty clear that the Nixon administration was going to get out and wanted to get the best deal it could on the way out with the limited leverage associated with its obvious intention to get out. Similarly here, the president wants to get out of Afghanistan and is trying to get the best deal on the way out. And then, a lot of Americans convinced themselves in 1973 that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were bent on compromise rather than conquest. And so we could leave without seeing them try to topple the government in Saigon. Of course, that turned out not to be the case. And today, one hears often the Taliban's changed. They're as tired of war as we are, and all this stuff. And what they want is compromise. Maybe, I hope so, but it's entirely possible that once the United States leaves, then they attempt to topple the government in Kabul and take over the country again, just like the North Vietnamese did in South Vietnam and turned the whole country into communist rule.
Just 2 years later.
The final kind of historical, potential lesson here is both in Afghanistan and in Vietnam, it was not the withdrawal of foreign troops that led to the fall of the government. Both in, Saigon didn't fall till 75, and the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 89, but the government didn't collapse until 91. It was when the dollars or the rubles stopped, the military and other forms of aid to the partner government. And so again, the lesson that people have taken from this, so we cut off aid in 75 to South Vietnam, and Saigon fell. The Russians, the Soviets cut off aid in 91 to Kabul, and the government fell. So the lesson some have said is, well, okay, so we keep the aid flowing indefinitely. But I think there's yet another potential historical lesson, which is that Congress is much more inclined to write gigantic checks when there are American troops in the field, and much less inclined to write gigantic checks for countries in the billions of dollars indefinitely when it seems like one of many potentially worthy or troublesome places, right? Yeah. So how all that nets out, I'm not terribly optimistic, but I also haven't read the secret annexes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Which hopefully will be disclosed at least to Congress and won't be so secret. But
yeah. So, well, they have been disclosed to Congress. Okay, it's folks were reading just in the last couple of days. But, if it turns out these guarantees don't work, you can either rely on the secret annexes, which reportedly allow for continued special operations and intelligence presence there to go after terrorists. We could just learn as a country that if there are terrorists with global reach that are in Afghanistan, we're just not going to worry about it as much as we used to. We're a more resilient country. Or we can do what we did in Iraq, which is get out completely and then go back when the situation deteriorates, which would mean that this is not the end of our longest war, but actually the new phase of it. So
yeah, just an interregnum in it. So anyway, all right. Watch that space, listeners.
Yeah.
So okay, next up, again, as we continue to spin the globe just a little bit further into South Asia, let's talk about the state of U.S.-India relationship. And I want to start it with a little vignette. 2009, I was on a trip to New Delhi with our mutual friend Dan Twining and a few others as part of a German Marshall Fund delegation. Free plug there for the great folks of the German Marshall Fund. And we happened to be in New Delhi the day that President Obama gave his pretty landmark speech at West Point announcing what was going to be the Obama administration's surge in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Sending over 100,000 troops there trying to finally win the, quote, good war.
Yeah.
And the day after the speech, we were going into a bunch of our meetings with Indian officials there in New Delhi. And I was, fully expecting that they were going to be excited about the speech because I was, in my naivete, thinking that they would see this as America's long-term commitment to the region, as America's commitment to finally bringing stability and a happier outcome there in Afghanistan, which is a very big concern of India's. And instead, we were just subjected to a barrage of criticism and frustration, and you know exactly why. It was because President Obama announced the drawdown date in that same speech, saying, and in 2011 we're out of there, or at least diminishing the troops way down. And so that's what our Indian interlocutors seized on, and to them it signaled, "See, we knew we can't count on you Americans. The Taliban's just going to wait you out, and then you're going to leave us with essentially a proxy state that our adversaries, the Pakistanis, can continue to exploit." And so on and so forth. Anyway, for me, it was a telling illustration of how American actions in one country will be perceived another way, or can have broader regional or even global ramifications. So I guess with that as our segue, tell us your assessment now about how the state of the U.S.-India relationship. I mean, we had worked on it back in the Bush administration. There were very big hopes there for it being eventually a really important new, strategic partner, even alliance partner. Some of those have been realized, others probably not. So anyway, would love to hear it.
Just on this Afghanistan point with India, there's you're absolutely right. There's also a more fundamental problem, and always has been, between the United States and India when it comes to Afghanistan, which is that at the level of objectives, we are absolutely together with India. Neither of us wants to see the Taliban win. Neither of us wants to see the country return to its status as a sanctuary for international terrorists. Both of us wants to see, the kind of rule of law and basic stability there. But at the level of tactics, or how you actually do this, there's been great disagreement. The United States has thought that we should talk to the Taliban. The Indians have said, no, you shouldn't. The United States has thought Pakistan has to be part of the solution. India's always said Pakistan's the problem. We have said an eventual drawdown of American troops is the right way to go. The Indians would like us to keep troops there forever to try to keep a lid on things. And so there's just not any agreement on what it takes to achieve those objectives. Now, stepping back for a second, the broad story of U.S.-India relations since really the last year and a half or so of the Bill Clinton administration is one of the unparalleled successes in U.S. foreign policy, I think, across very different administrations, both in the United States and in New Delhi. You have, a Congress party in New Delhi and a BJP party in New Delhi, both which are bought into this idea of closer ties with the United States. Republicans and Democrats, ranging from Bill Clinton to Donald Trump, have believed in this. The president just got back from India. And it's really been something of a bright spot in the Trump administration. I mean, there's been a lot of forward movement, a lot of this below the radar screen of the front pages of newspapers, but, to dial up the military cooperation, the diplomatic coordination, the revival of the quadrilateral dialogue, a bunch of these things that, on their own don't make huge news, but together it builds forward momentum in the relationship. I think there's two things that are potential sort of landmines. One is that both the Indians and the Americans tend to go through these periods of romanticism rather than realism in terms of what's possible in the relationship. We're not going to march out as, allies in a mutual defense agreement anytime soon, or maybe ever, probably ever. And no one's going to deliver India any more than someone's going to deliver to India the United States. But short of that, all kinds of things are possible, particularly given the shared concerns we have about balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and the rise of China and things like that. The other, though, is now Indian domestic politics, because some of the steps that post Modi re-election that the BJP party has taken on the Hindu nationalist account threatens to erode the support, particularly among Democrats and particularly among those on Capitol Hill, for what otherwise would be almost universal support for a strong U.S.-India relationship. And that's really a potential landmine in this.
Yeah. No, and he does have a troubling history, even going back to his time as governor of Gujarat state, of some of this, anti-Muslim rhetoric and actions. I mean, he was the first first foreign official ever banned from the United States, given a visa ban because of his responsibility for some of the religious persecution there, way back before he became prime minister. So there's a troubling history.
But 2002.
Yeah. But back to this larger question of India and geopolitics, do you see a fundamental willingness from India to embrace a role beyond just being a South Asian power, but really being an Asian power, an Indo-Pacific power, even if you will, there, especially as a partner with the United States on balancing some of China's aspirations? Because that's the really big fundamental strategic question for India.
I do, over the long run, and so some of this will be two steps forward, one step back, right? So, just a few years ago, people were wide-eyed about the potential of India to have a stronger naval presence in the Indian Ocean and things like that, which still is a possibility. But when the Chinese border flare-up happened a couple of years ago, suddenly the Indian Ocean looked like the region of secondary priority to the Indian Armed Services, who had to worry about their border with China, right? Yeah. But that said, the Indians we've re-energized the quadrilateral dialogue together with Japan and Australia. They've really beefed up ties, both bilaterally, both with Australia and with Japan, and to some degree with some of the Southeast Asian countries at a more modest level. India's ambitions and capacity are growing to play a larger, broader, regional, if not global role. The thing that we have to always remind ourselves when we're thinking about India, however, is just how many hundreds of millions of people live below the poverty line there, and how much of a priority economic development is for the Indians. And so, when we or anyone else go to the Indians and say, put your economic ties with country X in jeopardy so as to balance power, criticize human rights, whatever you want, it's a much harder thing for them to do than it would be for us. Yeah. And that's the backdrop against which Indian political leaders have always had to act. And we sometimes forget that when we fly over to New Delhi and just talk with the folks who, got their DPhil at Oxford and some are in Spain and things like that.
Yeah. So, well, Richard, our time is up, and this has been a fascinating conversation. We've assessed a good part of the world situation, at least across the Eurasian landmass anyway. So we'll have to have you back for another episode sometime to continue spinning the globe. But
thanks for having me. This is great. And anytime you want to have us all from Washington here in Austin for an extended period, you should just let everybody know. Well,
we would love to have a CNAS satellite office open up here in Austin. So anyway, all right. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.